Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. I am Reverend Devin, and if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and are open to a second opinion, please know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. And so please also feel free to like and subscribe and share these messages with anybody you feel called to. Our reading today comes from Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you as a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick, or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do this to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Hello, sisters and brothers. Welcome to another weekly meditation, and happy Thanksgiving. As you can see, we're in my basement today, and that's because I am out of a car for the week, which stinks. But I get to invite you to my home for the holidays as we talk about this passage from Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. This parable is one of Jesus' famous division stories. And he's talking about the time when God's reign comes to earth. The thing that we talk about in the Lord's Prayer. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Christians, for some reason, believe that that will happen at some point, and the early Christians believed it would happen within their lifetimes. So Jesus is talking to his followers, and he's trying to prepare them for that day. And he describes it as a day of judgment, a day of justice. And I think that we, within the progressive church in particular, tend to really look at that judgment part, and it freaks us out. I feel that a lot of Christians really don't want to be on the wrong side of God. And so as a result, when Jesus starts talking about dividing up those who do right by God and those who do wrong by God, we tend to focus a lot on the things that people are doing wrong because we don't want to do it. However, I think that the purpose of this passage is to focus on the things that people do right. Are we going to follow Christ's example and help God, follow God like a sheep does a shepherd? Or are we going to be resistant to God like a goat? And that is the image that Jesus is trying to depict through this parable. Are we going to be helpful to God, or are we going to be resistant to God in this life that we live. That will have an impact on our ability to engage with heaven. So I said, I feel this passage is focusing on the things that we do right. So Jesus calls up his followers and he's telling them, look, there are these two sides of God that you can be on, the helpful side and the harmful side. And he first tells us about what we can do that is helpful. He tells us that when you feed the least of my brothers and sisters, members of my family, when you clothe them, when you visit them in prison, when you are there for them when they're sick, when you do these things for the people who are struggling the most, you are doing these things for me, and by extension, God. He tells us this twice. He tells us this first when he's talking about what we can do to help God, and then when he tells us what we can do that harms God, he basically says it's when you ignore God's children, your brothers and sisters, your neighbors. And so this really is a passage that is meant to tell us that we are doing right by God when we love our neighbor. And he's following up on the commandment that he gave to love God and to love your neighbor. And Jesus is really making the case here that loving your neighbor is loving God. And so if we want to be on the right side of God, we should be doing what we can to love our neighbor. It's not a very complicated passage. And Jesus goes on to say, at the last end of this passage, that if we don't follow that commandment, we're basically in for a really, really rough time. I say it that way because I feel that when we have these judgment passages, when we see things as a judgment passage, we expect God to punish those who do not get in line, who violate the rules. We expect lightning to crack and come down from the sky and smite those who do wrong by God. But I don't think that that is how we historically see things work within the world. Jesus is giving us some good advice here. And when you don't follow good advice, often bad things happen. We are going to be celebrating Thanksgiving tomorrow. That is a holiday that centers around this story of a lot of our Protestant ancestors who came to New England and were rescued by native people living here. And how was that repaid? This act of kindness, of loving your neighbor. Well, I think that we as human beings often do have moments where love and charity break through all the craziness that we exude into the world. But that craziness, very often, which is a part of our lives, mucks things up, makes things way more complicated than they need to be. How did we repay our native brothers and sisters who were here before we arrived on this continent and helped us out on several occasions as settlers tried to make a foothold for themselves here in the Americas? We repaid them with genocide, we repaid them with displacement, and we repaid them with biological warfare. Thanksgiving is a time where we're supposed to celebrate family, friends. We're supposed to gather around a table and try to overcome our differences, and I think that that is a beautiful sentiment. I think that that is an activity that we absolutely should be partaking in, and it is an exercise in the type of love that Jesus encourages us to live into within this world. But the history of Thanksgiving also speaks to the reality of what we're struggling with, which I feel is another important part of the story that Jesus is telling us. When we are unable to love our neighbors, then that hatred, that fear, that harm that we give to our neighbors often does find its way back to us. When we look at what's happening in places like Yemen or Gaza, when we look at things that are happening in Ukraine or things that are happening in Ethiopia or Sudan, a lot of people have described these places as literal hell on earth as war continues to rip these places apart. And I think that it's not God who's creating that hardship. It's not God punishing those innocent people. It's our inability to recognize the good advice that Jesus gives us, that loving our neighbor allows us to avoid all this pain and hardship that we often, without thinking, bring into the world. So, if you're listening to the background, you may hear that Thanksgiving has come to the Fleury Thomas household, and so I need to bring things to a close today. But the message here, I feel, in this passage from Matthew 25 is a good one for the holidays. Loving your neighbor, making up with your neighbor, bringing them around a table and enjoying their company, learning to overcome those things that annoy you, and sharing good food. These are some of the things that we can do to follow Jesus in this world, to get on the right side of Christ, and to try to follow in that example of love that will bring us to salvation. Peace.